of the things which is mentioned within the film is artificial intelligence, the ability of machines, computers, to think.
Well, human brains can compute large sums very quickly. I want Christopher to be smart, make a calculation, and then to determine what to do next. Like a person does. Think of it. An electrical brain. A digital computer.
Thank you, Ken, for joining me again. So today we're going to be reviewing the movie, The Imitation Game.
Ooh, there we have it. Yep. Again, another film based upon real life events. These events took place during World War II when Britain and her allies needed to crack the German codes. They had this machine which kind of looked like a big typewriter, for one of a very basic kind of description. If people remember typewriters, those old enough may remember what typewriters were, big mechanical machine. But this machine was able to, you were able to put in a message and it would send a message out in code. The need to decipher these codes was massively important to Britain and her allies to help them win World War II. Now, again, this is all based upon real life events. I'm going to say I know a little bit about this, sort of very generic. So I'm going to say that to some extent, as is always the case with films like this, artistic license has been used to shorten time, to bring events together, using our main protagonists at times to represent things which would have happened, but they may not have done it. But they used dramatic effect, basically, to shorten the film's overall running length and just to kind of bring things together into a much more clear story for the audience. It's done in flashback, so it happens over 3 periods of time. It's when Alan was a child, probably about 12, 13, 14 years of age. So I think it's the kind of late 20s, early 30s. There's then obviously a situation where we're looking at the period during World War II, when he's involved in helping to crack the German Enigma machine messages. And then there's a situation after the war in the very early 50s when he is being persecuted because he's homosexual. So we have these 3 periods of time when the film is set in. The vast majority is set during World War II. Britain went on the hunt for some of the best mathematicians who would have come from places like Oxford and Cambridge, but also look to the general populace to find people who were good at crosswords, who were good at solving puzzles, who were good at maths, and all these kinds of skills which would have been needed to help to crack the codes. During his early school years, you see Alan Turing as a very introvert child. He's almost kind of OCD. There's a little sequence in the dinner hall where he's separating his peas from his carrots because they can't come together. You see him being bullied by other school students. You see him being nailed under the floorboards. He must have had one hellish time at school, to say the least. So you're kind of introduced, you're given a background, you're given a little bit of information as to Alan Turing later on in life. I get something which Lean on Me didn't have. There was no backstory. At least with this, there's a backstory. You're introduced to Alan. You're given an understanding as to who he is and how he's going to develop. You're given character traits from the very beginning. We are brought into World War II. It does flash backwards and forwards. It's not difficult to follow because normally it's subtitled with the year in particular. So you see his introduction to senior people within the British government, within the security services. You see how he is recruited and how he is brought in to help break these codes, because he is seen as probably one of the best mathematicians in the world. He's just one of the best mathematicians in the world, and they hope that he will be able to help them break the German codes, and for Britain and her allies to at least, have a chance of winning against the Axis powers. The third part of the story, which is post-war, is the fact that Alan Turing was homosexual, and at that particular point in the UK, that was illegal. The reason that he got found out initially was he was burgled, but nothing was taken. And when the police turn up, there's this police sergeant who's not a likable kind of character, actually, who thinks he's hiding something.
I checked. He won't say what's on.
Professor Turing? Detective Knock, Manchester Police.
Because he's not prepared to talk, because he doesn't get Alan. Alan's one of these very strange characters who has real problems. He's got real problems in terms of social assimilation. He doesn't know how to talk to people. Again, this is something which is alluded to during an interview he has with a senior member of the Navy whilst he's being recruited, where there's this whole thing about jokes taking place. And it's just over Alan's head. He doesn't get it. He just doesn't get it. His brain works in a completely different way. But anyway, going back to the police officer, the police officer is suspicious. He was burgled, nothing's taken. Alan's a bit sharp towards them. And that really puts the back up of the police officer who thinks there's something happening. This is very much British history, so very different to what we've done in the past, which has been American history. Any questions, any thoughts? I mean, what are your first impressions?
When you had suggested the movie, we actually then watched it. We were watching it actually as part of a class, information technology. And the reason that we had picked it, we picked it because we're preparing our students to go off and work. And our students are very much inner city, African-American, Latino, and all that. So they're not the same kind of people that are working in IT. So we kind of picked it because of the theme of it being very much having to do with information technology, but also the theme that you have people that are working in the field where, one, you have Alan Turing, who is probably on the autism spectrum. Number two, he's homosexual. That's illegal at the time, but like basically if he came out, that would be, he wouldn't be working there. And then Joan Clark, who's working in a man's world.
In terms of the technology, obviously it was the first programmable computer, set the path going forward in terms of what we have today. And I mean, one of the things which is mentioned within the film is artificial intelligence, the ability of machines, computers, to think.
Human brains can compute large sums very quickly. I want Christopher to be smart. Make a calculation and then to determine what to do next. Like a person does. Think of it. An electrical brain. A digital computer.
And to do tasks without the need of man. So it is alluded to, and it's definitely one of the things which the legacy, I think, of the whole Bletchley Park, of the whole Alan Turing. I mean, it wasn't just him. I mean, obviously, within the boffins, all of these massive, these people with incredible intelligence in maths and physics, in engineering, he was part of this huge group. I think he was the head of it, but there are a lot of other people. This wasn't just a one-man band. There are a lot of people, and there were thousands of people involved in code breaking. The machine which was created, absolutely revolutionary. One of the things which has been said on many occasions is that the ability to read the German codes shortened the war considerably and saved, innumerable lives as a result of that. I mean, obviously, the thing with being homosexual at that particular point, he was potentially much more blackmailable, if you can use that word. Yeah. It was much easier to blackmail because it was illegal at that particular point. We also have to look at the fact that during the film, it is alluded to, and I think you've kind of, it's one of these again where you have to understand a bit of the culture, but we have Burgess and McLean. So after the war, there were several senior members of intelligence who had come from Oxford, Cambridge, universities like that, who turned out to be spies. So they're spying for the Russians. This is alluded to on a couple of occasions within the film. But I think, again, it's one of those things, because I understand a bit of this history, I get it. I think maybe some of these things, some of these key pieces of information may pass the casual viewer by. Obviously, the Keira Knightley character, again, you're quite right. I think in this era, women were not seen as equal to men. They're certainly not. When she comes in after having won this competition to break this puzzle, this code, this crossword puzzle in a newspaper, she's kind of stopped.
You're not allowed in here, Mum.
Oh, but I'm only a few minutes late and...
The secretaries are to head upstairs. This room's for the candidates.
There's a little sequence where she breaks the code in like 5.5 minutes, and Alan Turing himself says, it takes me 6. So she's absolutely his equal in terms of, you know, the ability to break this code. And at the end of this little test, there are only 2 people who've managed to do this test, get past, and be able to sort of sit there with Alan and to go forward as part of the code breaking team. The other people within the team are drawn from other areas of expertise, and there is a certain amount of antagonism between some of these people, because Alan is just he is in a different league. You're right, he's probably on the autism spectrum. He's definitely he's not able to deal with other people. He wants to work on his own. So again, we're just building him as a character up.
Yeah, and so he's working on his own, trying to build this machine, and they're all trying to break the code. Every day they start with the first code that's broken at 6 a.m., the weather report, and they have until midnight to try to break the code, and then the Germans reset the Enigma machine, so they have to start over, and they get really frustrated with him because he's like, I'm doing something more important than you. He's very much doesn't pick up on the social cues. He's like, I'm going to build a machine that can break the code, and they just think he's wasting their time. And Joan Clark actually kind of coaches him a bit.
It doesn't matter how smart you are. Enigma is always smarter. If you really want to solve your puzzle, then you're going to need all the help you can get. And they are not going to help you if they do not like you.
So they start to warm to him once she kind of coaches him on that.
There's a figure which is bandied around in the film, which is there's 159 million permutations. And to break one message will take 20 million years to decode. And the other code breakers are looking short term, just, you know, trying to get this thing broken by throwing manpower at it. And Alan's kind of going, you can't do that. You need a machine. You need a machine.
A machine to break the machine.
To break the machine. So his whole reasoning is that you need to build this machine which will allow them to break these codes, which are, as you say, changed on a daily basis. They had Enigma machines. The Polish, prior to the war, were able to get an Enigma machine into the UK. So they knew what the machine looked like. They knew how the machine worked, but it was just this breaking of the codes. If you typed in the word A, the machine would punch out the letter T. But if you typed in the letter A again within another word, it would push out the letter Z. So it was always constantly changing. So there was no commonality. And that's the number of permutations this machine could create. No 2 letters would be the same. There's a little piece within the film where they're all in a bar. They're all in some kind of bar. They're all having a drink. One of the main protagonists, one of the main code breakers, is trying to create a relationship with another young lady who's one of the code breakers. She reads the codes. She's taking in messages as the Germans are sending messages. And she makes this comment about the fact that she has another lover. And that lover is on the end of a Morse code machine. And Alan's listening to this, and there's a piece of information put across that you can read code the same way that you can read a person's voice, because different people will tap in a different way. So Morse code is a series of dots and dashes, for anybody who doesn't know. And the way you tap, different people tap in different ways. So you can actually, for a trained operator, they can listen to somebody sending a message and go, oh, I know who that is, because they always tap like that. That's the way they do things. And she makes this comment about the fact that she knows this other person, probably a man.
Well, each of us intercepts messages from a specific German radio tower. So we have a counterpart on the other side who's tip-tapping out the messages. Everyone types a touch differently, so you get to know the rhythm of your counterpart.
Has a wife or a girlfriend, because he always puts a message on which he thinks is a name. And it just sparks them into realizing that they can eliminate some of the permutations. And then it becomes quite obvious, and I know this is fact as well, that they signed all of the messages at the end with Heil Hitler. So they've just eliminated a whole series of other letters out of the equation. And this helps Alan and his team to speed up the process of breaking the codes. I mean, we have to go back slightly because there's a lot of backstory here in that they face a lot of problems from the authorities, from their bosses, in terms of how long it's taking them to create this machine to break the codes, how much this is costing, not just financially, as £100,000, which would have been a lot of money in those days. And Alan Turing actually had to write a letter to Winston Churchill to get this money authorized. So he was obviously pulling strings somewhere along the line. But, you know, his senior bosses, Alan Turing's senior bosses, both in the military and in MI6 and MI5 and other military intelligence groups who were operational at that particular point, they are keen and eager that this process be broken as quickly as possible, because they absolutely need to be breaking these codes, reading the German messages and being able to react and to help break the war. But these two little pieces of information from somebody in the sideline, somebody relatively, well, unimportant to the film, are the things which lead the system of code breaking forward. And from my understanding of history, there's a great deal of truth in this. You know, it was a couple of simple things which did help them understand that parts of the equation, parts of this jigsaw puzzle could be removed, and it helped to shorten how the period of time it took to create what was called Christopher. Alan Turing refers to the machine as Christopher, which is a reference to one of his best friends, or his only friend at school, who died of TB. So when we're flashing backwards and forwards across these three periods of time, Alan, after having been nailed under the floor by some pretty horrible students, is released by another student called Christopher.
Alan, are you all right?
And he develops this relationship with Christopher, and this relationship builds, it's alluded to, but also Christopher is big into codes, and they're both big into mathematics. So, you know, you have to be watching this film to see these references and to understand how the film moves ahead. It must be said, it was only on the second watching that I got the Christopher reference, that the machine is called Christopher in homage to his friend who died of TB as a school child.
I think I got that reference because of the fact that we were teaching it, and the teacher that I work with kind of like brought that up. Like, we actually did a little, you know, a game with the students and stuff. And he kind of also told them a little bit about the story, because we're having teenagers watch it. And so there's like a big generational difference. So he kind of gave them a little bit of backstory of Alan being like on the spectrum and all these different things, so they would kind of understand it. One thing that my students found surprising, there was a point where they were passing notes and the notes were in code, but the teacher then took that note and crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. And my students were like, the teacher took the note, because they couldn't believe it. In our schools, kids get away with a lot of stuff. So they were like, wow, like he actually got in trouble and he had the note taken.
Christopher and Alan are sending messages to each other in code. This is the point, obviously, where we are introduced, or it is introduced, about Alan's interest in codes, in code breaking, in mathematics, and how mathematics helps to break these codes. Above my head. I mean, I can just about write. So when you see people who can look at this and look at these sequences of letters and numbers and understand what they mean, yeah, it's kind of, it's a foreign language to me. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit. So obviously we're introduced to Joan early on, where she attends the session to see if she can become a code breaker, because she doesn't have the security classification to be looking at these things. And Alan is in need of another mathematician of a similar caliber to him. He steals, he takes, he removes various codes, pieces of paperwork, stuffs them down his socks, stuffs them down his trousers, cycles off to where Joan is, and kind of gets into her bedroom, and they come together in a way that they become a team in terms of the code breaking, in terms of how they're going to go forward with this. So he very much, they have this kind of friendship. Well, there is a friendship there, is non-sexual. It's but very, very professional, but there's this thing about them caring, in theory, caring for each other and being, she's kind of attached to him, he's kind of attached to her, but it's very, very subtle. There's no in your face about any of this stuff. It's all it's all very, very subtle. But he trusts her as a mathematician and as a woman, as an equal in terms of being able to help him and be part of the team to push, to drive the code breaking forward. I mean, one of the things which isn't really alluded to particularly is the number of women who were at Bletchley Park within code breaking and within taking down the messages, because there were thousands of messages, so they're having to constantly write these messages down. And I mean, there were a lot of women there. It was a big old place. So again, quite a few thousand people from, if memory serves me right, in terms of the numbers there of people helping to collect the messages. And obviously you had the super brains creating the systems, creating the machine to break the codes. One of the things which again, artistic license coming in, is there's a sequence where after we've had this meeting in this bar where this little fragment of information is put across that I know when I'm listening to my opposite person in Germany, because of the fact that he types in this particular way, he codes in this particular way, and the fact that, you know, they always begin the message, the weather message, and the end of the message with Heil Hitler. They then run back and spend some time reprogramming Colossus to break the codes. And at this particular point, it suddenly dawns on them, if they'd instantly reacted and used the information of the codes they were breaking without a lot of careful thought as to how they used it, they would have destroyed all of the work they had done, because the Germans would have instantly known that this so-called invincible, unbreakable Enigma machine had been broken. And it's about a convoy crossing from the US or from the UK to the US or across the Atlantic Way, and they have to allow the convoy to be attacked.
Good God.
Oh, I don't think even he has the power that we do right now.
No. There's going to be an attack on a British passenger convoy. Right there.
God, you're right. Well, those U-boats are only 20, 30 minutes away.
Now, like I said, as I understand, that's true, but probably not Alan Turing and his team. This was very much other people, as I understand. But the message is that, you know, you've got this information, but how you use this information is as important, because, you know, you don't want the enemy to know that you're reading their codes. So they were having to then use more maths to work out how they could sensibly use these broken codes, what information they could use. So is this casual that we just happened to have a squadron of Spitfires which were flying there when they intercepted a squadron of bombers? The fleet happened to be there because they were there ahead of time. So they had to then create algorithms to let the military know how much of that information they could actively use and how much they just had to stand back and go, okay, people are going to die for the greater good, because the enemy cannot be aware that we've broken the codes. But yeah, as I understand, that little sequence is very much artistic license. I haven't done any research, so I can't verify that, but as I understand from what little information I have, there's a little bit of artistic license, a bit of shortening of the story, a bit of dramatizing things to create this effect, to create this situation. And added to this, one of the code breakers, his brother, is on one of the Navy ships.
Peter, what's the matter with you?
My brother's is on the Carlisle,
which is at the center of this convoy passing through the Atlantic.
I want to backtrack a little bit, because we're talking about Alan and Joan, and the whole thing is that at first when she's picked to have this job, her parents don't want her to go because she's, you know, she's a woman. She should be like trying to get married and all that. And she shouldn't be like working with a bunch of men. So he kind of changes it around that she will be working, I think, in Hut 3 with woman code breaker or woman taking down the codes, having different like activities like that are being run by the woman. And then later on, the parents are asking her to move back because she should be married and not be working. And Alan actually proposes to her.
There's a as you were talking, you were saying, obviously, he goes to her parents' place and they're sitting in another room having a chat, and they're actually using code.
It would be indecorous.
What in the world does that even mean?
They're sort of talking and looking at each other, affirming what the situation is. And he does seem to pick up on the fact that her parents are concerned. And he kind of mentions or alludes to the fact, oh, you'll be with other women who are also here, and they all live in the village and they go to the local church. He does pick up upon that, and they do use visual code with each other as this chat's happening in the living room, as a way of appeasing her parents who are listening on. So yes, and obviously, as you say, he offers to marry her as a way of keeping her within the close circle of the code breakers.
Oh my God.
This makes sense.
Did you just propose to me?
Which is the logical thing to do.
I think, if I remember rightly, having seen the film a couple of days ago, the situation where she is with one of her friends, who's the person who informs Alan about how she can detect her counterpart in Germany because of the way he taps these messages. I think this is happening the engagement ceremony, or the drinks to celebrate the forthcoming wedding of her and Alan.
And then this whole thing where she's engaged, he's also hiding the fact that he's a homosexual. That's where it comes into play that, you know, one of his friends picks up, like, he's like,
what if I don't fancy being with Joan in that way?
Because you're a homosexual.
And then basically he's like, his friend, John, ends up saying, you can't tell anybody this. You can't tell her that because women don't really like to accidentally marry homosexuals. And you can't tell anybody this because it's illegal. And then this ends up being used as blackmail against him.
And this guy is a double agent. So he's working for the Russians, who were our allies during World War II, but were also our enemy, but our allies. I mean, very much a threat as a nation, but very much, you know, one of our allies in terms of helping to defeat Germany. In fact, probably the country which lost the biggest number of people had in terms of the destruction of their own country. 30 million people died as a result of that war in Russia, and 50 million in total. It was, you know, an immense number of people, more than the population of the UK at that particular point. But yes, this guy's a double agent, and yes, he's in a situation where he has the ability to blackmail Alan because of his homosexuality. So they're kind of keeping secrets from each other. There's a lot of secrets in this film, lots of secrets, and it's kind of mentioned on several occasions. It's if you're not paying a lot of attention, you can find yourself being lost, because there are secrets here, there are secrets there, there are crosses and double crosses. There's the guy from MI5 who's playing one person off against another person. I can't remember his name. I think it's probably indicative of this period of time when secrecy was super important. I mean, there was an expression which was walls have ears, so you wouldn't talk about things outside in public in bars. And they are. This is the weird thing. They're in the bar, they're talking about all these secrets, and I'm going, oh, you shouldn't be doing this.
Shouldn't be doing that.
Again, you know, it's this thing about sometimes you're having to play for artistic license things which would have not actually happened in real life. These events would have happened elsewhere. But yeah, there's lots of little pieces of information floating from one person to another. There's hierarchy. So I think it's Dynaston, who's the admiral.
Right.
Commander is the Navy, and he thinks he's the head person, but MI5 are above him, and then you know, other people are above MI5, and then you have Churchill, and things aren't told to Churchill. Churchill's not telling this person, he won't talk to. An absolute minefield. An absolute minefield.
Actually, I think it's Stewart at MI6, actually, they said, because they said, oh, there's only
yes,
five.
sorry,
They made a comment at the beginning, there's only five divisions of intelligence, but it was MI6.
This is Stuart Mingus, MI6.
There are only 5 divisions of military intelligence. There is no MI6.
Exactly. That's the spirit.
Stewart plays this MI6 officer, I guess, or agent, and he ends up, Alan walks in and finds him in Joan's apartment, and he ends up telling her that Joan's been arrested, and then that is after Alan has discovered that John is a spy, and he's like, actually, it's not Joan, it's John, and he's like, yeah, I already know that. I placed him there.
You recruited him because of that fact.
Yeah, and so basically, he ends up getting him to kind of like give him information, because like, okay, you wouldn't want Joan to be arrested, so he ends up kind of like becoming part of this whole ring of like protecting the fact that there's a spy here and all this kind of stuff. And then after that, Alan gets very scared for Joan's safety, so he ends up breaking the engagement.
Spider's web of intrigue and double crosses all the way through on this film. So after they've managed to break the codes and to read the German ciphers, we get to the point where obviously the war eventually ends, and Enigma and the codes and all this information is in theory burnt, destroyed. As I understand, that wasn't quite the case. We kept those machines going for a lot longer because some of our allies, our closest allies, were not aware that Britain had this ability to read codes, because obviously other people during the war, at the end of the war, were picking up the Enigma machines and were able to use those machines for themselves. We kind of then, at the end of the war, we move forward, and we've obviously had flashbacks, but we move forward to the point in time in the very early 50s where Alan is now being persecuted and eventually prosecuted for being homosexual. He's in a situation where he's picked up by the police. He's taken into a police interrogation office, cell, whatever you want to call it. And the police officer who is trying to prosecute him has been unable to get a lot of information, because literally Alan Turing's records, war records, have been pulled. There's nothing. He actually comes in with an empty envelope and says,
"What's this?"
Alan Turing's classified military file.
Bloody empty.
Exactly.
You know, the suspicion is that he is a Russian spy because of the fact he's been at Cambridge, and Burgess McLean and several other major spies of that era had all gone to the same universities. Alan kind of has to try and explain to himself that he's an odd kind of war hero, and they use this as a way of bringing some of the information together. And he talks, the police officer is kind of aware of what Alan has done, but probably is incapable of actually understanding the papers which Alan has written about computers, programmed computers which can think. So Alan does this little speech, this little talk, which is overlaid with images about how his team helped to win the war, but they weren't at the front. And so he asks him about, you know, he says there are, I think, 3 pieces of information off the top of my head, and he says, this is how you define what a machine is and what a machine thinks. It's how you interpret this information. So he goes through this story and he says, so how do you see that? Is it a machine talking or is it a man talking?
That's unbelievable.
Now, detective, you get to judge. So tell me, what am I?
And you know, we kind of get to the end of the film, and it finishes with a very sad situation where Alan is being chemically castrated.
It's the medication.
The medication?
Well, the judge gave me a choice, either 2 years in prison or hormonal therapy.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Yes, that's right. Chemical castration.
Desperate desire to stay out of prison, to continue his research, his continued development of Christian, of the Colossus machine, of the code-breaking machine.
Not alone. Never have been. Christopher's become so smart.
And eventually in, I think it's 1954, when he was in his early 40s, he commits suicide. He's exposed in the newspapers as being homosexual. Joan comes back and returns and has a chat with him and says she would have helped him. She would have been a witness, etc., etc. An incredibly sad situation for, an absolute genius who helped not just Britain but the Allies win World War II. Took his life because he was gay, because of the social repercussions, because it was an illegal act in those particular days. It's absolutely no consolation today that I think in the late 90s,
I think it was 2013 that he was
as late as that?
Yeah, that the Queen
pardoned him. I mean, it's absolutely no consolation, but today, on the back of a £50 note, he's commemorated. Shouldn't have been that way. We lost somebody we shouldn't have lost because of, an absolute genius. But irrelevant, we lost, somebody took their own lives as a result of that. But yeah, at least I have to say that on the back of a £50 note, he is commemorated. So it's not much. It's not much. I think a lot of people would not be that aware of that period of time anyway, the history, the code breakers, the many code breakers, the many people who were involved in the UK and elsewhere breaking codes, and obviously Alan and the rest of his team in terms of creating the machine, which was the forerunner of what are today's computers, which have led to AI, have led to the situation now where you pick up your mobile phone. It's not a phone, it's a computer, which is a camera, which can search the internet. Oh, and you can actually make phone calls on it.
Exactly.
It's all the result.
The father of the modern computer.
Absolutely, father of the modern computer. So, a very sad story.
I want to bring up one quote that comes up 3 times in that last scene. One of the first scenes at the school, a scene between him and Joan, and then the last scene with him and Joan is. And the first time is Christopher saying it to him, and then him saying it to Joan, and then Joan saying to him.
I think that sometimes it is the people who no one imagines anything of, who do the things that no one can imagine.
My favorite quote from the movie.
Yeah, brilliant. I think you're right. It starts with him and Chris under the tree, if I remember rightly, when they're doing the codes. And yeah, Joan does it, and it's mentioned again at the end. Yeah, it's mentioned 3 times. I mean, I don't know whether that's something which was made up for the film or something which was real. But it's a brilliant quote, isn't it? An absolutely brilliant quote.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for suggesting it. I watched it a few times, and I would watch it again.
I mean, you said you played it at school. I mean, obviously. How did the youngsters, how did the kids, how did the pupils deal with that as a film? How did they, what was the kind of feedback?
I think they liked it, but I find that young people have a hard time concentrating because you have all these TikToks and all these short things, and we didn't have them watch it all at once. The class is 45 minutes. So the teacher would stop and kind of point out things because maybe like they didn't understand something, or maybe he'd ask them questions. So we kind of broke it up, and I think they did ultimately enjoy it, but there was a kind of thing of like, okay, they're not getting into it as much as he would have liked. And I think it's the whole thing that they just don't have the attention to watch anything past 30 seconds.
Yeah, and this is the kind of film which you have to watch because of the information, even with artistic license, the information which is being put out there. You have to be able to grasp that. You have to be able to take that information on board to lead you through the plot generally, but also the flashbacks and I'm going to say flashback, because obviously we're seeing it from a period of time which is ahead of the 50s, the 40s, and then the 30s as a child. But yeah, you know, having a 30-second attention span is going to be very difficult when you have a movie which is based upon flashbacks. Bit of a shame, because it is a great film.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for suggesting it.
So what is the next film?
So I think that we've been doing some stories that are based on, you know, history and everything else, that maybe we should do something completely different. And actually there was something in the news the other day about Area 51 and some people from the military saying that there were actually aliens found. I don't know if that's actually true, but I thought we would do this crazy movie called Paul.
Oh, the British film, the comedy.
The British film. Apparently there's two British people and they're like going to see Area 51 and they end up like bumping into an actual alien. So something completely different for a change.
That is chalk and cheese from that. Absolutely. Yeah, I've definitely got that. I've definitely got that on DVD. So I'm not going to have to hunt eBay. That's a dramatic change, actually, because I do remember it being, well, it's very British humor. So I'm going to see how you deal with that in terms of the British humor, in terms of how that comes across. Well, good one. Good choice. Good choice. Yeah, I'll get on the shelf, pull that film, and I'll get watching it, because it is a great film. Brilliant.
All right.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Looking forward to it.
All right. Thank you.